Salutations, respective viewers. I am George from Ireland, and I'm in front of the bust of Bernardo O Higgins here in Richmond upon Thames. So this is a suburb of London in the United Kingdom. So O Higgins is best known for having been the Supreme Director of Chile for several years, from, if memory serves, 1822 to 28, until he was pressurized into resigning. So his job title was not president. The head of state was Supreme Director. Obviously it's nowadays it's president. So people sometimes list him as president, which is not quite accurate, but okay, let's not split hairs. So he was born in Chile I'm just trying to think about this, because he came here in 1772, if I got that right. Never mind. He's born in the late 18th century, though I do remember his date of birth, 20th of August, oddly. And he was born to an Irish immigrant father and a Chilean woman who was of Spanish blood. Because remember, certainly in northern Chile, almost everybody was ethnically Spanish. The indigenous people tended to be the majority further south or else higher in the Andes Mountains. So he was brought up a Christian in the Catholic denomination. Now, his parents were not married, and so I don't think he ever met his father, actually. But nevertheless, he grew up in considerable opulence because his mother, perhaps surprisingly for a well-got woman, had an intimate liaison with a man when she was not yet wed, which you would think would be regarded as scandalous in upper-class Chilean society. But even today, in 21st century Chile, having children out of wedlock is a bit of a no-no. I mean, it happens, but it's not, people aren't as blasé about it as they are in this country, for instance. So what else about O'Higgins? So his father came from, I think it's Roscommon in Ireland, because I've been to that county and the neighbouring one, Sligo, and I recall seeing the little memorial there, and it's almost like in the middle of the nowhere, but I think it's perhaps where the O'Higgins family homestead was, and they weren't particularly well off, because I was staying around Loch Arrow. This is donkey's years ago, and Loch Arrow is in Roscommon, if I've got that right, but the nearest big town is Sligo, so I'm not absolutely sure if the O'Higgins memorial in Ireland lies in County Roscommon or in the adjacent county of Sligo. But anyway, so quite a few Irish Catholics went to Spain and joined the army there. Partly, some of them were still Jacobites. Remember, the supporting descendants of James II, wanting him to be King of Ireland, as well as King of England, King of Scots. And that was that. And Spain was the foremost Catholic nation, and that's why the King of Spain had the title His Most Catholic Majesty. Anyway, O'Higgins' father was dispatched on colonial service to South America, remembering at the time Spain ruled everything from California to Tierra del Fuego. So Spain was quite mighty in some respects, certainly ruled a vast amount of territory, was the largest empire in the world. The expression, the empire upon which the sun never set, was originally said of the Spanish Empire. Only later did the British borrow that expression, because, you know, as the sun is on her diurnal round, we're orbiting the sun, obviously, but at some point the sun is shining on territory which is ruled by Spain, okay? Whether it's in Peru, or it's in the Philippines, or whether it was in, the Western Sahara, or wherever. It was a bit of an exaggeration what they said about the Spanish Empire, but nevertheless, it was certainly very potent. So I'm not aware that his father was involved in the Jacobite cause, but he sought advancement in the Spanish army, because in Ireland and the Irish army, only Protestants were allowed to be officers until the end of the 18th century, and the majority of us, like over 70% of us, were Catholics, so we were discriminated against by law. The nobility and the landed magnates in Ireland were Protestant almost without exception at the time. But Catholicism was no disadvantage. In fact, in the Spanish-speaking world, you're on the inside track if you're one of those. So that was that. So Bernardo O'Higgins had a superb education. He briefly went to university in Lima, Peru. That was it the Viceroyalty of Granada, I think, or New Granada? I can't remember. I always get mixed up between which one was Granada, which one was New Spain. And that was that. Reading the classics, was also mathematically gifted. And perhaps surprisingly, he was sent here to the United Kingdom So a Protestant country, a country which Spain didn't always have good relations. Remember, the American Revolution was taking place about this time, and Spain was an enemy of the United Kingdom. But not a lot of Americans are aware of this, but Spain declared war on the United Kingdom during the American Revolution. They saw that the United States had, the UK had its hands full battling revolutionaries in America. Obviously, France and the Netherlands also declared war in the UK. So Bernardo O Higgins went to a Catholic school here in Richmond, which I filmed elsewhere. You can't see it at this angle. It's up behind there, halfway up Richmond Hill. So there was a small Catholic minority in Great Britain at the time. There were particularly few of them in and around the London area. Back then, Richmond was considered to be a town in Middlesex, so well outside London. Until the late 18th century, Catholics were actually banned from living in London, had to live a certain distance from it. Look at the River Thames behind, and there's Richmond Bridge. So, for example, Alexander Pope, a celebrated poet, had to live out here because he wasn't permitted to live in London on account of being a papist, and presumably got that surname, Pope, because his family were adherents of the Pope. So O'Higgins spent 3 very happy years here, and I think he's partly learning seamanship, and acquired a good grasp of the English language, which was highly unusual in La Hispanidad at that time. It wasn't even that common when I was in Chile in 2003. So anyway, he returned to his homeland. Well, fast forward to the Napoleonic Wars. The King of Spain was a weakling, was really sort of mentally feeble, and his wife was having an affair with a prominent count. But anyway, Napoleon was the master of the continent, and Napoleon prevailed upon the King of Spain to abdicate, to renounce the Spanish crown for himself and his family forever. So we know heirs and successors of his blood. And instead, Napoleon put his eldest brother, Joseph, on the throne of Spain. So Joseph went to Madrid, that was it, he was crowned the King of Spain. Now most of the Spanish people did not accept that there was the May Rebellion in Madrid, and the French troops managed to put it down, but this spread all over the country. So that's when the word guerrilla was invented, as in little war. They're fighting as irregulars in the mountain passes, and Spain is a very mountainous country, it's got some very defensible topography. So the French army's advantages are very much negated by the geographical situation. Remember, the French army was not that French, and about half it was French. There were many so-called French soldiers who were actually Spanish, Portuguese, German, Italian, just about any European nationality you can name. In these faraway Spanish colonies, the people saw, well, the true King of Spain has been pushed off his throne by underhand means, and okay, he is not compos mentis, the king, so this has no validity, his act of abdication which he signed. We do not accept this French usurper as king. You know, Joseph Bonaparte, he's a mere parvenu, like his brother, a jumped-up bourgeois. He's not of the blood royal. So they could be loyal rebels, if you see what I mean, to reject Madrid's authority on the basis that that's not Spanish authority, it's really French authority, because the interloper is there, and wish victory to the Spanish forces who are resisting the French invaders. But anyway, it was a horrific war, went on for a few years. Now you might say, what, as opposed to a nice war? Now obviously no war is cuddly, and obviously people are going to get killed, but there might be some ethical rules. Is it permissible to kill an enemy soldier in combat? Yes. Is it permissible to deliberately kill civilians? No. Or if you capture someone as a prisoner, can you kill him? Well, no, you mustn't. Now I know you might, this is before the Geneva Convention, but okay, some of the Spanish guerrillas were fighting outside uniform, and the French said, well, they're not real soldiers because we're fighting for the real Spain. King Joseph is the King of Spain, as the Spanish authorities acknowledged. So there was an argument the French had for saying that these guys are not real soldiers, they're rebels, and shouldn't be treated as prisoners of war, and so forth. But anyway, and then people were sometimes killed, and not even cleanly, in a particularly slow and sadistic manner, and mutilated. And anyway, it was ghastly. But so Madrid, whether you're talking about Joseph or you're talking about the actual Bourbon dynasty in Spain, had lost control of the colonies, and the British intervened. This is a peninsular war, as the British called it, as in the Iberian Peninsula, with helping the ally, which had been an English ally since the Middle Ages, Portugal, and then the Spanish, and gradually defeating the French in Spain. King Joseph, not recognized as a proper king by most Spaniards, was too terrified of assassination, wouldn't leave Madrid, and after a while wouldn't even leave his palace. So he eventually fled with his tail between his legs back to France, Remember, he came from Corsica, so it was dubious whether he was Corsican at all. And in fact, he'd been born in Corsica before it had been even owned by France. When he was born, it was owned by the Republic of Genoa. Okay, his first language was Corsu, a dialect of Italian, and he'd only started learning French when he was about 10, when he went to Brienne, this boarding school in mainland France. And that's why he, like his brother Napoleon, was never completely fluent in French, was often speaking ungrammatically, and why they hardly ever wrote anything, because they always let them down with their grammatical infelicities, liked to dictate things, hoping that their secretaries, who were invariably male, would silently correct any of their grammatical mistakes. That's why Napoleon Bonaparte was known as paille au nez to his classmates, as in straw in the nose, because they were ridiculing his Italian accent. And obviously didn't even speak standard Italian, spoke Corsu, as in the Corsican dialect. But back to Bernardo O Higgins. So anyway, the Spanish royal family was restored, but people in Chile, some of these people had got used to self-governance and didn't want to be ruled from Madrid anymore. But remember, to sail from Chile to Spain took months in those days, because you had to go around Cape Horn, and it was very variable according to the currents and the winds how long it was going to take. Remember, the Panama Canal wasn't completed until 1914, and there was no fast means of communication. So we say it was ruled by Spain, but Spain had to have a very hands-off approach. I mean, it was very much arm's length, them trying to dictate what was happening in these colonies thousands of miles away. But anyway, O'Higgins and so on, they wouldn't accept even the pretense of being under Spanish control, saying we're not Spanish, we're Chilean. Yes, we speak Spanish, it doesn't mean that we are Spanish. Look at the United States. Okay, they're an Anglophone country, doesn't mean they're British, and blah, blah, blah. So the Spanish never properly regained control, so fighting broke out in Chile, and in fact most of these Spanish-speaking countries in Latin America. And indeed, it was here in London that Bernardo Higgins, he met Francisco Miranda, who was from what's now called Venezuela, and he was a man of a like mind, and they had both had fairly radical opinions, as in the abolition of slavery, greater freedom of expression, because there's quite strict censorship in the Spanish Empire at the time, and certainly the right to vote for the propertied classes should be extended to more people, things like that. So these were very advanced views for that era. They didn't go all the way towards equality, but certainly the abolition of slavery, because really until the 18th century it seemed to be that almost nobody believed in equality. Obviously those who were abused, held in servitude, were presumably not too keen on being bondsmen, but often those people would not have a principled objection to holding others in thraldom. And gender equality, well, that was seen to be a mental disorder in those days, if you proposed that. So O'Higgins and his chums, they were fighting, but there were still more than a few Chileans who were still loyal to Spain, who believed in the Spanish Empire for various reasons. So it was a tough fight lasting several years, until finally they succeeded. They had some setbacks, such as the Battle of Aconcagua. I'm trying to make it a bit brighter as the sun is going down. And that was that. So it was Simon Bolivar, in what's now Venezuela, was also fighting at their side, and the country Bolivia is named in his honor. There's San Martin, the Argentine general, and during their fight against the colonial authorities, when O'Higgins was briefly defeated, he had to flee to Mendoza in Argentina. That's why when you drive there, you go through Paseo de los Libertadores, and the Pass of the Liberators. But anyway, so eventually he succeeded, and he became Supreme Director of Chile, as in ruling the country for several years. However, he clashed with some very powerful vested interests. Major landowners thought his reforms were going too far, and they managed to twist his arm into retiring early. He shifted to Lima, Peru, where he spent much of his youth, and he lived out the rest of his life there. He died. So that is Bernardo Higgins. And he'd led soldiers in the field and sometimes, so he very much led from the front. He was no slouch, a very significant person in Chilean history. And one of the other guys who was one of his close comrades in this fight for independence was McKenna, was a Chilean of Irish stock as well. So there were not that many Irish people in South America, but we seem to have had a disproportionate influence on the course of South American history. So that was O'Higgins. Now the thing is, the United Kingdom decidedly hypocritically thought that independence for these Spanish colonies was a many splendid thing. Now, why did London think it was so splendorous? Not that they cared a fig for the independence of these countries so much, but simply it was beggar my neighbour. They would like to enfeeble the Spanish Empire. Now, Spain was technologically behind, wasn't at all industrialized in the late 18th century, seemed to be cursed with this sclerotic governmental system and so forth, and militarily unsuccessful. But there was always a chance that the Spanish would sort it out and get their act together, in which case they could be a very powerful enemy. Because they just had enormous resources, natural resources, manpower and so forth. So the British were very keen to split them up, and then they had fairly friendly relations with some of these countries. You remember George Canning, also Irish. He was the United Kingdom's Foreign Secretary at the time, and he very much gave his blessing to these Latin American independence movements. And that was that. There was the Canning Club was founded here for Latin American diplomats and business executives, and was going in some form well into the 20th century. And in Oxford, there's also the Canning Club, which is a sort of conservative discussion club, because George Canning was a Tory. The Tories obviously evolved into the Conservative and Unionist Party. But George Canning, he later became Prime Minister. My goodness, I ought to know this. 1827, but he died after only 119 days in office. He died of some illness over in Chiswick House, same room where Charles James Fox had expired by an exceedingly curious coincidence. And you can see actually the O'Higgins, the naming practice is O'Higgins Riquelme, as in Spanish-speaking countries, you take one surname from your father, one from your mother, and to the next generation, though, you only need to pass on your father's surname. Otherwise, the surnames would just increase exponentially. Think of it like that paradigm about the grain of rice on the square in chess. 1 grain of rice on the second one, and then 2 grains of rice on the 1 grain of rice on the first square, and 2 grains of rice on the second square, and so forth. And if you kept doubling the number of grains of rice, how many grains of rice would you have by the time you got to the 64th square? I don't know, it would be some staggering sum. So they don't do that. They've got to be a little bit rational about it. But that is Bernardo Higgins, who lived on Chile till he died in 1844 at a very grand old age. Because I'm just thinking he was in his 80s by the time he died, which was exceptional. But his body wasn't repatriated by the Chilean Navy until 22 years later. A good job that they did, because the way to the 1870s, the Peruvians might never have given it back because of the War of the Pacific. Bolivia used to have a coastline, which is Bolivia still has a navy. Hope springs eternal in the human breast. Well, I suppose they can paddle around Lake Titicaca just in case they get the coast back. The Peruvians used to have the land down to Iquique, but they lost it in that War of the Pacific in the 1870s. But the Chilean military often invokes the spirit of Bernardo O Higgins. Okay, so that is enough about O'Higgins here in Richmond upon Thames.